Hey everyone, welcome to episode 4 of our Road to Easter. Hope you've been tracking with us over the past several nights. If you haven't, make sure you catch up. Today, we're going to get to hear from one of our friends and an incredible individual by the name of Tuvya Zaretsky. He went with us to Israel a few years ago. He was raised Jewish and then decided to become a follower of Jesus. So he's technically what you refer to as a Messianic Jew. We're going to hear from him about that experience, but also what does the Passover mean? And it is the first day of Passover today. What does that mean for the Jewish people and also for us reading the New Testament when Jesus had this Last Supper with his disciples? Thanks so much for joining us. Hope you enjoy my conversation with Tuvia. All right, Tuvia, thank you so much for joining us. I'd love for everybody to get to know you just a little bit. So give us a little bit of who you are and your bio, so to speak, or your Wikipedia page. So go for it, buddy.
Thanks, Rusty. First of all, a blessing to be invited to do this. Tuvya Zaretsky. Yeah, that's my name. It's that's not the name I was born with, but it was the Tuvia was my Hebrew name. My folks had changed the family name in order to protect their identity as Jews, and so we had a non-Jewish last name. And anyway, that's I've got the family name and my Hebrew name now, and it's been that way for since I was in my 20s. Mm-hmm. Work with Jews for Jesus, serve as a missionary doing outreach work to Jewish Gentile couples in intercultural ministry, living in Los Angeles, and serving now, this is 46 years. It's been a real blessing to do this. Yeah. One wife, joy of my life, that's Ellen. And she's also a Jewish believer. We've got 3 young adult kids, and 1 son-in-law and 2 grandchildren now.
That's great. So did you grow up in the States or in Israel, or give us kind of your growing up stages?
My mom and dad were both from immigrant families. My mom's family came from Hungary. She grew up in, of all places, the Holy Land, which we call the Bronx, New York. My dad's family came from Belarus. He was, they couldn't get in the United States, so they settled in Canada. He was, they were the ones that changed the family name from Zaretsky to Carson, trying to hide the Jewish identity. But he came into the U.S. to help out in World War II, served as a doctor, and yeah, it was, his name had been changed by that point. But they met at a USO club, married in California here, and that's where I grew up. Okay. So my growing up experience was a typical, very, very traditional American synagogue experience.
Okay. Yeah. So at what point did you decide to explore Christianity or begin to investigate your faith and then make it your own or become a Christian?
Messianic Jew.
Yeah, Christian Messianic Jew. They both work for me. Boy, it was not something that I was looking for. As a kid, I had one real passion, and that was, I just wanted to know God. I mean, there was two things drawing me. One was the Bible stories that I was reading in my Hebrew education, Hebrew school education. And I kept saying, how come God was talking to Moses and Abraham and David and not me? The other part was the natural revelation. I would look at the stars in the sky and I go, wow, there's a real God, but I don't know him. I wonder why not. So as a kid, I went through what's called a bar mitzvah at the age of 13. And I read from the scroll of Isaiah chapter 6, where Isaiah hears God calling out and he says, whom shall I send and who will go for us? And Isaiah's response was, Hineni, send me, I want to go. Well, that was the theme of my bar mitzvah. But afterwards, I went back into the synagogue sanctuary and I said, God, I just said, Hineni, here am I, but where are you? I don't know you. It was at that point that I think there was this hunger from the very beginning for a relationship with God. Everything about Christianity was totally foreign. It was just not part of my world. Our world was us Jews, them. We didn't call people who weren't Jewish necessarily Gentiles. We just said they were Christians, which got really confusing, So I didn't want to do anything with Jesus. I didn't want anything to do with Christianity, but I really wanted a relationship with God. And about 10 years later, I graduated from a university here in Southern California. I was working with a drug clinic, and I was asking serious questions of God. I mean, life had become very, very painful. My best friend had died when I was 16. I never really resolved that grief of losing a friend, my best friend. The Vietnam War was happening. The country was really divided. My dad, who'd been a military veteran, was really upset that I was criticizing the way the war in Vietnam was being prosecuted, and I had friends coming back saying, don't go, man. They don't want us there. It's just all kinds of a mess and chaos. And I'd gotten into drugs, and it was working for a drug abuse clinic in the community. I just didn't have any answers. I didn't know how to stop my own hurt, and I didn't know how to resolve any of that. And so I was looking for answers. And I went to talk to a woman who was on the general board of our drug clinic. She was a Christian. She tried to tell me about her faith and tried to tell me about Jesus, and I would blow her off. I would just embarrass her and make it so that she didn't want to talk to me about anything spiritual. But there was a point where I went over and I told her, look, I'm ready to just throw in the towel. I don't know what else to do here. And she said, look, if you're out looking for answers, why don't you ask God? And I tried to blow her off. I said, I've been talking to God since I was 13 years old. I went through all that in my bar mitzvah. And she said, well, ask, you'll receive, seek, you'll find, knock, and the door will be open to you. And I'd never heard that before. I had no idea who said that. It sounded like something God would say. I'd never opened the New Testament, so I had no idea that those are the words of Jesus in Luke's Gospel, chapter 11. I literally went out that night and I prayed to the God of Abraham. I called him the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I want to get the right God talking to me.
Right.
I said, I'm asking, seeking, and knocking. Who are you and how am I doing? And I was really pleading with him. I said, my heart is broken. I don't know where else to go. Do I qualify in your kingdom? And who are you anyway? It was at that point that the relationship started to unpack for me as he began to answer that prayer. Showed me my brokenness. Didn't quite understand it was sin until I started hearing some things that some Christians had written when I got curious enough to read what they'd said. Read the Gospel of John, was utterly shocked. I thought, Jesus, I thought I had the wrong Bible. I mean, I thought Jesus I knew he was Jewish, but I had no idea that he went to synagogue, that he spoke to Jewish people in the temple, that he got into discourse with the Jewish leadership. I had no idea that he said that he talked about the Torah. And when he talked about Torah, I understood what he was saying, but it was at a level of law keeping that I knew I could never keep. And it was at that point that I understood that he'd come to take that issue and resolve it by his death on the cross. It was really, really hard. I went to a Christmas pageant. Never been in a church before, never heard the gospel, never been through the whole story. I mean, I'd been reading some things, but it came together that night. And it was right before, it was like December 7th. So it was right early, just before Christmas and Hanukkah. But I heard the words of Jesus saying, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me." And my first thought was, great. I've been looking for life. I've been looking for God. I've been looking for the way to know him. Everybody knows Jesus didn't come for the Jews. Remember the woman that was on the general board of the drug clinic? Said, "Go ask God to show you the answer." She was sitting in front of me inside in a chapel of 1,200 people. I was in the back row. Nobody could see me, right? She heard my voice, turned around and said, "What is wrong with you?" And I said, "Everybody knows Jesus didn't come for the Jews." And she said, "When he made that statement, he was talking to a crowd of Jewish people just like you." And she turned around, and I thought, I'm an idiot. I went out that night and I realized that I had to grapple with this message, and it was true. And I was really afraid because I knew it was going to mean everything. It means my parents would see me as a betrayer. They would see me as a destroyer. But this was the truth. I came to faith that night, told God, "I don't know how to do this. You got to meet me tomorrow." And there've been a lot of tomorrows since that time.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And we'll talk more about that and about how you connect with people that are living that tension of maybe were raised Jewish and they are looking for something more and aren't finding it. Maybe they are living with somebody who is Jewish and they're trying to reconcile their Christian faith with Jewish heritage. So we'll talk more about that in a podcast, which I'll direct everybody to on my website, pastorrustygeorge.com, and they can get that as soon as they're done watching this. But I wanted us to talk specifically about Passover. And it's Wednesday. Passover has begun today. Is that right?
Yes,
so,
sundown.
So with that in mind, let's go right to the upper room, which you and I have been to together. I remember that moment. Yeah. And Jesus is there with his disciples, probably the third Passover meal they've shared together. This one's a little different. So would you walk us through just some of the elements that are out there, and what does Jesus do that's so significant that most of us Gentiles really, we miss because we think it's just the Da Vinci picture, right? Yeah. Walk us through that.
Yeah. Well, the frame of it all has to start with the fact that he was on his way to Jerusalem to die. And the reason he was going to Jerusalem to die is at the very beginning in the Garden of Eden, God said to Adam and Eve, "You disobey me, dying you shall surely die. Death is a result of disobedience and sin." He said he's going to send the seed of a woman to accomplish reconciliation in Genesis 3:15. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, he promises through Abraham would come this child, the seed of the woman, who would be a blessing to all the nations of the earth. So God comes in the person of Jesus to accomplish that through the Jewish people. Could have been anybody. You could be talking to somebody who was a Hittite if it had been different. But he set aside Abraham and his followers, not because they were big or powerful or perfect, but because God needed a people to accomplish his redemption plan. And so Jewish history, the history of Israel in the Bible, is part of something that sets this frame for us. So Israel was set free from slavery in the land of Egypt 3,400 years ago, close to 3,500 years ago. And at that point, he sets aside a memorial night. He says, look, on the night that the worst plague is coming upon Egypt, God says, I'm going to set you free. And it's going to happen by the blood of a lamb. That's why we keep a lamb bone on our table, to remember the blood of a lamb during Passover. And every year we have a lamb bone at the table now. Some people eat lamb, but A lot of us just keep the lamb bone, to remember the blood of that lamb. So Jesus comes to the city of Jerusalem knowing that he's been sent to be the perfect Lamb of God. And John calls him the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world when he introduces him into the populace of Israel. So he comes to Jerusalem on Passover. He sits with his disciples to keep this festival to remember our redemption. And then he tells them, I've come here to die. This is the whole reason. And in the middle of Passover, he takes two of the most crucial elements, the cup of redemption and the unleavened bread that's been wrapped in a linen cloth and buried for the night. Brings them back out. And as he hands them these items, we read in Luke 22, verses 19 and 20, he says of the bread, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. So the perfect parallel, Passover is the remembrance of God's redemptive might to redeem Israel out of slavery in Egypt. Jesus takes that Passover, gives it the fullness of meaning, and says it's his body by which God is going to redeem all of us. If we'll trust and believe in him, it's going to be through his blood and his body at the cross of Calvary. Raises the third cup of the night called the cup of redemption. Luke says it was a cup after supper. That's the cup of redemption. And he says, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. So that's, Jesus takes the elements of Passover, puts the parallel between the Passover back in Egypt, the night of remembrance, and gives to us, the body of Christ, this brand new festival to remember our redemption. For Christ, our Passover, has been sacrificed for us.
Take us into that room there with those guys. I mean, a lot of them were Jewish. They've been raised with this meal. How weird would have all that been for Jesus to say, to pull out the bread that had been kind of buried, so to speak, and say, this is to remember me, and make it all about him? Would that have just been a crazy moment for those guys?
Oh yeah, everything about it was crazy. I mean, he walks in, the first thing that you do is you wash your hands. So he sets aside his robe and bows down and washes their feet. Now they'd heard he was the Messiah. Remember, just a week or two before, they'd been at the Transfiguration. They heard God say, this is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him. And then he says, I'm going to Jerusalem to die. You look back at those passages in Matthew 17 and the parallel passages about the Transfiguration. The disciples were grieving. They couldn't believe that he was talking about going to Jerusalem to die. He's the Messiah. So I mean, right from the get-go, and when he bows down to wash their feet, they're thinking, this can't be. He's the Mashiach. He's the Messiah. Why is he washing our feet? You know, so right from the very beginning. And all those, I think all the way through those, it was a didactic, a teaching moment, a very important teachable moment for him to lay these things before them. Obviously, they left a huge impact on him, on all of them, because they all wrote it in their Gospels.
Mm, that's a good point.
Yeah.
So we've been talking through this week-long series as we march through the Passion Week about how Jesus doesn't just walk us to a grave, but through a grave. And we see in 1 week of Jesus' life how to live our one life altogether. What do you take out of this Passover feast, this upper room moment with these guys, that you look at Jesus and you just think, wow, that's the way to live? What does he do here that's so significant for all of us?
Well, I mean, first of all, to give us some hope and help at this time, this is a remembrance that this is the precursor to the resurrection. So he came to celebrate this feast. The worst part of it was to know that he was going to have to go through the pain, the horror of the degradation, humiliation, the punishment on his body, and then to have the Heavenly Father turn his face from him and cast upon him the judgment for all of our sin. Passover for me and the celebration of the resurrection is so powerful because it's a remembrance that no matter who I've been, no matter what I've done, I talked about, some of the foolishness of my life before I was a believer, all of that now can be forgiven, I have to start by forgiving myself because God forgave me, and to know the depth of the power of his love. And so Passover is remembering our redemption. And it's not just just a concept and an idea. It's the fact that God was giving us something to remember what he actually did. And that brings us then to the cross, his death, his burial. And I think the biggest mind blower for the disciples, of course, was after they'd seen all this, after everything was going totally outside of the script that they figured was going to happen when the Messiah came, to now see him resurrected, nail-pierced hands, sitting and eating fish with them, eating some bread, and they're hearing the words, "Do this in remembrance of me as often as you do this."
Boy, when we get to heaven, I'd like to see the video of those moments, right? Just sitting there on the shore eating breakfast with him that one day. Boy, those guys must have just had their jaws dropped the whole time.
I think Peter's got some stories to tell all of us.
I think he does too. I think the other guys have some stories to tell about Peter
Sure.
too. Tuvia, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much. We'll keep our discussion going via the podcast, and for all who are watching right now, you can get that at my website, and then you can hear more. And I cannot wait to talk to you more about just how we interact with each other and help people understand the gospel. So thank you, my brother. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Rusty. It's an honor. I love what's going on up at Real Life Church. Thank you.
Hey, thanks again for tuning in for another episode of The Road to Easter. We hope that you've been blessed by these each and every night. I know I have. It's been really cool to engage with you guys during the message and afterwards as well. And so we hope that you're encouraged each and every night. And so tonight we had a special guest. We had Tuvya Zaretsky, and we got to hear his journey in coming to know Jesus, his incredible background in the Jewish faith, and his insight and profound knowledge on the Passover specifically. And I don't know about you, but it just, when I read the Passover story, when I hear Tuvia talk about the Passover, it just reminds me of God's mercy. And I think this is an incredible time as we're quarantined in our house with our families or our roommates or even by ourselves, and we're able to have access with people through video chats and stuff like that. That's a time that we can share with each other about how God has shown up and we've experienced his mercy in our lives. And so maybe there's an opportunity this week for you to make a special meal this week and sit around with your family or your roommates or Zoom in using a different video chat, whatever you want, with some friends or some close neighbors, whatever it is, and to ask that question: where have you seen God's mercy in your life? I already know what story I'm going to tell with my family. It's the story of my daughter's epilepsy and the night that we discovered her in her first seizure, and how God's mercy was all over that night and is still on her life. And so we are so incredibly thankful, and it's a daily thankfulness that we thank God for the mercy that's on her life and on our whole family's life. And so whatever it is that you're going to share as you sit around your dinner table with that special meal and talk about where you've seen God's mercy in your life. And as we're talking about families, don't forget, we have special services for kids and for students during the week as well. You want to check the websites and see what times those are at. Well, tomorrow night, we've got another special episode as we continue on this road to Easter, as we talk about dread. It's a topic that we all dread. We don't want to face some of the things in our life that cause anxiety and worry. And so we're going to listen to Rusty talk about and see his time when he was in Israel, where Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane before he was crucified. You don't want to miss it. I'm going to stick around the chat a little bit longer, so we'd love to hear your questions and chat with you guys there. We'll see you tomorrow.